Welcome to the JOMA Preventative Health Podcast, hosted by the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association. We provide you with up-to-date information on health topics geared towards the Orthodox Jewish community. This podcast content is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice or as a substitute for the medical advice of a physician.
Welcome to the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association, or JOMA podcast. I'm your host, Elisa Minkin. I'm a general pediatrician and proud JOMA member. And tonight I'm really excited and really honored to be introducing and interviewing Elyan Rosenbaum. Elyan Rosenbaum, LMHC, NCC, is a licensed mental health counselor in private practice. She specializes in working with women of all ages struggling with anxiety or trauma. Elyan is trained in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, and internal family systems, IFS, two cutting-edge, deeply transformative therapy modalities. Her practice, Rosenbaum Therapy, is currently providing online therapy via telehealth to all residents of New York and New Jersey. Visit rosenbaumtherapy.com to learn more. Follow Elyan on Instagram at Rosenbaum Therapy for all things mental health. So I'm really excited to be doing this interview. This really should be listened to in conjunction with the interview I did the week before with Robin Gutman, which is also on a trauma-based therapy called trauma-focused CBT. So all three of these therapies are potentially good therapies for people struggling with trauma. We talk more about types of trauma, a little bit about what's called big T and little T trauma in the talk with Robin Gutman. So again, I do recommend that they be listened to together. The other point I'm going to make is that the therapies we discussed today, EMDR and IFS, or internal family systems, have both evidence base. I like to say whether what I'm talking about is evidence-based or, sometimes I will be talking about alternative therapies that may not have such an evidence base, and I will be upfront about that. The other thing I want to say is that it can be a little confusing at first to hear about internal family systems because it sounds like it's family therapy, which it isn't. It refers to a family of different parts within us, which then makes you think about, is this multiple personalities, which can get really confusing. And I will add that there's been past controversy with some what I think of as abuse of IFS with these recovery of false memories and false accusations of abuse. And that should not reflect at all on the current use of internal family systems. And it, again, should not be confused with multiple personality disorder, which is now called dissociative identity disorder, which we do not diagnose. So I hope people find this interesting. Again, anybody who has ideas about topics or wants me to interview them, please reach out to me at health, HEALTH, at joma.org. And Elyan was one of the people who reached out to me and said, hey, I want people to know about EMDR and IFS. And here I am interviewing her. So thanks for listening. Welcome, Elyan. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me on. Excited to be here.
I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate your reaching out to me to cover this topic. And I'm really excited to learn more about something that I had not even heard about before. So the timing of this is perfect. And the reason is because just last week, I interviewed Robin Gutman, who does trauma-focused CBT. And I had mentioned that I had somebody else to interview about other therapies, including EMDR. And here you are.
Here I am.
So it's beyond perfect timing. So I'm really excited, and we're not going to go into as much explanation of what's trauma and why there are, specialized therapies, and the therapies that you do are not just for trauma. I want to make that clear.
Right. So, that's a great question if you're asking.
Okay, sure. But we're going to get to it.
Yeah. I do work with women generally struggling with anxiety and or trauma. Anxiety is a symptom. Trauma is usually very often the cause of the symptoms. You come to it, right? And again, when you talk about trauma, it doesn't have to be the big T trauma that it can be anything that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. So anxiety is a symptom. And when we talk about IFS, well, I'll explain a little bit what that means. But generally, it's trauma. People, it can be manifested through anxiety, and that's why they seek EMDR or IFS therapy. But trauma is usually at the core of it.
Interesting. I mean, I guess, getting my brain wrapped around the fact that it's not just big T trauma. There's also the so-called little T trauma that we talked about with Robin.
Okay.
So that's great. So yes, you emailed me and said, I have 2 therapies that I want people to know more about. So we're going to talk about both of those therapies, and we're going to start with the EMDR that I can never remember what the R stands for.
So it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Reprocessing.
Class. It's a mouthful. Yeah. And I think it makes sense to start there because that's how I started in terms of my trainings. I started with EMDR because it was well known. I had heard about it in graduate school. There is, it's known throughout the world. Because it has tremendous, outcomes and implications. It's effective, it's efficient, it's evidence-based, and it's really life-changing. So I started with EMDR, and I was using it in the clinic where I was working with clients that come from all sorts of backgrounds, but the vast majority of them had trauma histories, some more extensive than others. And I was trying to use EMDR with my clients after I had been trained in it. I felt like, I had a huge key, and I was going to give it to everybody, and they were going to heal and have beautiful lives. And for some clients, it worked. Magic. It's like magic. It feels like magic. It really does. And other clients, I found that what I didn't know at the time was that protectors were coming up for them, and understandably so. If they've been through tremendous trauma, developmental trauma, complex trauma, their system needs to be protected in order to survive. And so what I didn't realize was these protectors were coming up for them, not allowing us to get to the trauma because it was too overwhelming, too frightening for their systems.
We're going to get to what those protectors are. That's part of the IFS, the internal family systems.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to go back to EMDR and really go into it in depth.
Sure.
And I just also want to mention that I believe EMDR is a form of exposure therapy. And there is another form of exposure therapy, I believe, that is more intense.
Yeah. So
I've heard this referred to as exposure therapy light.
Okay. That's fair.
So if you think about it, you might have a spectrum of, and again, I don't want to overgeneralize, and you're the therapist and I'm a pediatrician. So I only have a very superficial understanding, but the way I kind of understand it is exposure therapy is very extreme. It can be very painful, and traumatic to relive these traumatic experiences. And then EMDR, we're going to talk about as a modified form of it, and then IFS may be an even slower, gentler, more of an exploratory process. Would that be fair?
Yeah, somewhat. Yes.
Superficial.
Exposure therapy really is re-exposure, right? We're going to face our fears and overcome them, right?
Mm.
I don't. That doesn't sit well with me,
right?
I'm sure it helps people. That's terrifying. I don't want to relive my traumas.
Right.
I don't. And so that's one form of therapy. I have no idea how it really works.
We're not going to talk more about it. I just wanted to mention it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. EMDR is not exposure therapy. It's a healing therapy. So what happens when a person experiences trauma, and I'm sure you discussed this somewhat with Robin, is that it overwhelms the system. And, in terms of technicalities, right, the prefrontal cortex gets really, literally the neurons disconnect from the limbic system, from the amygdala. And so what happens is the person literally gets stuck in their senses and their emotions, and they can't connect to their prefrontal cortex. They can't connect to their reason-making part of the brain, the thinking, processing part of the brain. And so what happens is we get stuck in this emotional state, right? And irrational beliefs about ourselves emerge, right? And so I experienced a trauma, and then I believe I'm to blame, or I deserved it, or I can't trust anyone, or it could be, there's a whole list. I'm trapped, I'm powerless, I'm defective, I'm worthless. All these irrational beliefs, and different for different people, different experiences form. And although logically one can think, how am I responsible? I was a child. I didn't deserve that. I deserve good things in my life, right? But there's a disconnect between the logic and the emotion. Just because I understand it logically doesn't mean I feel it that way. And the feeling, the emotion is real, right? And so I get stuck in that. So what EMDR does is it literally reconnects. It reconnects. So now I'm have this really irrational belief about myself, this negative, nasty belief about myself associated with the trauma. EMDR allows us to go into the person can go inside their own brain, literally, and heal it so that it reconnects to the prefrontal cortex. And now you can think rationally about it and really make sense of it. And you no longer carry those negative beliefs about yourself. Does that make sense?
So no, I still don't understand it. How does it do that?
Okay. So great question. How does it do that? So what we do is it's a protocol. You have like eight steps to it, right? And so what we're doing is let's say we're having the person, they're coming, what are you coming in for therapy for? You have this theme. I don't know. My dad, my relationship with my dad is so wounded. It's so hurtful, and he's still in my life, and I need to sort of process, setting boundaries and what that's going to look like for me or whatever. Okay, so you have this trauma associated with your father. When you think about the trauma with your father, what irrational beliefs about yourself come to mind, right? What is it that you believe about yourself? And sometimes the person will start spewing different beliefs about themselves, and other times they can use help. So we have what we call the greatest hits list of negative cognitions. And I literally can read it out to the person and say, which of these resonate with you and which of them don't, right? And so usually we'll find 5, 6, 7, 8, even 10, 15, depending on the trauma, that really resonates with the person. And so once we have a list, right? So with this theme, these are the negative beliefs I believe about myself associated with it. Then I'll have the person sort of evaluate which one's strongest, which one's second strongest, third strongest, like which one has the most charge, right? And then we're going to start with number 1. And I'll have the person float over the course of their life and identify the first time they believed about themselves this negative belief, the worst time they believed about themselves this negative belief, and the most recent time they believed about themselves this negative belief. That gets the whole train of that negative belief. And then we can actually do a future template. So that's sort of exposure therapy light, right? Where you're exposing them to a situation that will likely be in where the positive cognition that they reprocessed to will actually serve them, which is really amazing. So what we're doing is we're laying down a map, right? This is where it started. This is when it was really, really bad. This was the most recent trigger, right? A trigger essentially is a reliving of the trauma, right? If we can go to the core, we call it the touchstone memory, and heal that core, then the next trigger, which is the worst, and then the trigger after that, most recent, they'll resolve much sooner because the fire, the gas tank, whatever you want to call it, is out.
It's like you're rerouting.
You are literally reconnecting neurons in the brain to an adaptive place, to the reason-making part of the brain. Yeah. And so it's a whole process, right? So after we have that all set up, right? And even before that even starts, we do resourcing, make sure the person has ways to ground themselves, make sure the person has ways to contain distress if we don't get the levels of distress down to 0, which is neutral or no distress at all in the session, right? Because we don't want them carrying it throughout their week until we meet again. So just different resourcing standard in EMDR. Then we're going to map it out like that. And then once the reprocessing stages start, do you want me to walk you through it? I don't know.
A little bit, but what I'm really understanding from listening to, and this is really helpful, is, and I had heard it called exposure therapy life, but it's not, because exposure therapy is desensitization and this is reprocessing and changing.
That's
very
right.
different.
That's right. It's healing. It's healing.
Right.
If I cut my finger, my red blood cells, whatever, white blood cells, they come and they'll heal it. The body heals it. The brain works the same way. It's wounded in some way. The neurons have been disconnected. It needs to rebuild those. And that's literally what we're doing. Yeah.
It's amazing.
It's
so
amazing.
You were walking us through it. The more you talk, the more I understand, and my listeners will understand. So
okay. Yeah. All right.
You're doing great.
So this is the reprocessing stages, right? EMDR is 8 phases. And so right now we're up to phase 3. And so what we'll do is we'll set it up for the person, right? And if you're going to call it exposure therapy, which is not, but if you're going to call it, this is where it is, right? Because we're getting into it. So, and we're getting into it not in a rational, trying to make sense of it way. We're getting into it in an emotional, sensational way. You know, Bessel van der Kolk, he's the guru on trauma nowadays.
Heard the name, yeah.
Yeah, he wrote The Body Keeps the Score, and it's literally true, right? Trauma is stored in the body. It's stored in the senses and emotions, in the physical as well, right? It's literally in there. So that's what we're tapping into that. So I'll ask the person. So we have this negative belief about myself, and we identified, let's say, the first time it happens that I believe this about myself, right, irrationally. So I'll ask them, looking back on it now, think of an image that represents that target memory. They don't have to tell me what it is. And I literally have reprocessed memories with people, and I know nothing. They say, just the other week, someone said to me, I've never told anybody this, and I'm not ready to tell you this, but I know I need to process it. And I said, okay, if you're ready to process it, let's do it. You don't have to tell me anything. I don't need to know anything. It's all in your mind. It's in your brain. I'm just here to facilitate it. But you don't need to share anything you're not ready to share. You don't need to.
Is there an age limit or a verbal ability limit for this?
So I only work with adults, but EMDR is used with children. There are people who specialize in that. And I think they use different sort of tools with it, right? They'll have, like, let's say, pictures and drawings, and they'll have, I don't know exactly how it's done. But I only work with adults. So I haven't ever done a training for children, but it is done. It is.
Right. So it wouldn't be entirely dependent on verbal ability then?
I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyway, for adults, this is the protocol.
Okay, we're going to stick with adults here.
Yeah. So we asked them to have an image of this target memory, whatever that looks like for them. Mm-hmm. They don't have to describe it to me, just for themselves, right? When you bring up the image, is the negative belief that goes along with it, I am to blame, whatever that their belief is. And they'll say, okay, yeah, that's true. Then I ask, when you bring up the image, even if it doesn't feel true, what would you like to believe about yourself? And this is just setting up this is not actual for the reprocessing. This is just setting up sort of for the after the reprocessing. So someone may say, I'd like to believe that I'm not to blame, right? And later, when the person has reprocessed, then we're going to ask, is that the positive belief that is now associated with it, or is there something better that fits now? So that's not really part of the thing. It's just setting it up for later.
Setting the stage.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so then going back, what emotions do you feel when you link the image with the negative belief of I am to blame, right? So all they're sharing is nothing about the memory. It's just about themselves currently in the moment. So they'll list their emotions. And then I'll ask, what is your level of disturbance as you bring up the image, the negative belief, and those emotions that you just told me all together? 0 being no disturbance or neutral, and 10 being the worst you can imagine. So these are subjective units of disturbance or distress. And the person will start, I've had 10s, I've had 7s, I've had 6s, I've had 4s, depends, it's really subjective. They'll decide how traumatic that memory is for them, how much it distresses them, right? And so let's say on average, start at 7 or 7.5, right? Okay, so that gives me, as the therapist, the starting ground. Mm-hmm. And as we're reprocessing, it's going to go down and down and down, right? And then I'll say, what are you noticing in your body in this moment as you bring up the image, the negative belief, and those emotions all together? And then I'll say, you're going to start the reprocessing, right? So I'll say, bring up those body sensations, bring up the negative belief and the image of the target memory, and just notice whatever you notice as you begin to tap. I do virtual therapy. So I'm not having the person track my fingers. They're doing bilateral stimulation like this.
What does that do?
Bilateral stimulation. So from what I understand, there's two main reasons why you'd want the bilateral stimulation. And it can be any bilateral stimulation, right? Traditionally, it's tracking the therapist's fingers like this. And there's so much research done, and they've connected to REM sleep and different processing the brain does when you sleep. When I went virtual, I couldn't have my clients track anymore. It didn't work. And so I switched over with consultation. I switched over to tapping, and it's just as effective.
Really?
And even when we were in person, I had tappers, like these little balls that the person would hold, and I can control like the buzz that it would give, and it would go bilaterally, right up, and you can control the speed of it or whatever. It could be sound. It could be a beep, 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 beep. The person could be tapping their legs. They could be tapping their feet. It's just the bilateral stimulation. So what is the purpose, right? So from what I understand, twofold. One is that when we're doing this work, we really need all wheels turning, all sides of the brain working, everything invested, because this is exhausting work, and it needs to have all our brain parts on board doing this work together, getting it all moving. That's one reason. The second reason is that when we're revisiting the trauma, we don't want to fall back into the trauma. We don't want to re-traumatize our clients. And so we have, by tapping on myself or by following a finger or whatever, I know that I'm here. It's, in this room, I'm safe, and I'm not back in that trauma. So literally you're keeping like 1 foot here, 1 foot back there.
Like grounding. Like grounding.
Safe, right? Because different than exposure therapy, we don't want to expose.
Right.
We don't want to fall back into that trauma. And
it's grounding. It grounds you.
Yeah. So it keeps you here, it keeps you present. And it also helps get all the different parts of our brain lit up.
I wonder if it's similar to exercise, like, how when you exercise and you're releasing dopamine and whatever biochemically is happening, and you can think more clearly and process things more clearly. I wonder if it's like brain exercise. I have no idea.
Yeah, well, it's certainly interesting because Francine Shapiro, the woman who developed EMDR, the story goes, legend has it, she was walking or running in the park or something, and she was thinking of something distressing, and she was running, right, or walking. So it was that bilateral stimulation, right, left. And at the end of her run, she no longer felt the charge or the burn of whatever was distressing for her. And then she went on to sort of research it and ask her colleagues, is there something to this? And then she just developed the EMDR. So exercise certainly it has that bilateral stimulation, and somehow it gets all our juices flowing.
So who would this not be appropriate for?
That's a great question. So that is how I got to IFS, right? And so working in the clinic with some of my clients that had developmental trauma, complex trauma, where their systems were really, really protected and really guarded. I would start, let's say, reprocessing with somebody, and she would say to me, my head is really, really hurting. I can't do this anymore.
It's too much. It's too much.
It became physical. The sensation became physical for her. And so then I knew we can't continue. Her head's pounding. We're not going to do this work, right? And so then, or sort of organically, I went to sort of inner child work, sort of focusing on, well, what's going on for you? And what is this that's coming up for you? And so I sort of started dabbling in parts work on my own. Another client might totally dissociate, right? Because this is too much, too overwhelming. Her system can't tolerate it. So then all of a sudden I have nothing. I see nothing. I notice nothing, right? So then we know that she's not present. She's dissociated. And so in that case, that's not an appropriate candidate for EMDR yet, because she's not able to stay grounded.
Right. So you're saying that this is somebody who has to do more inner work before they can do EMDR. So we're going to talk about IFS as that kind of inner work in just a minute. How long does EMDR normally take?
So I've reprocessed complete memories, right? So let's say somebody has this theme, they chose, let's say, this one major irrational belief about themselves, their first, their worst, their most recent, and even did a future template in 6 sessions. 6 sessions,
Wow.
completely and it's not just because when you reprocess that one negative belief, very often the 4 other following negative beliefs are impacted by that, and it no longer is true. So I just last week, again, I was doing EMDR with one of my clients, and she had a list about 7 different negative cognitions, and we reprocessed the most charged one, and then we went back to revisit the list, and I read them to her, and she's like,
Doesn't apply.
I don't believe that about myself.
Mm.
It dissipated. It was unbelievable. It's incredible.
But what I'm guessing is that there's some people who are basically very together, mental health wise, and then have something happen to them, and then you can fix that more easily than, say, a chronic childhood trauma.
That's right. Especially like relational traumas and stuff like that, where it was developmental. The person's system needed to be incredibly guarded and protected. And going back to that wounding is so terrifying. And so those protectors will come in to literally save the client, right? And it's necessary. So there's nothing wrong with those people. Their bodies and mind is doing what it needs to do for survival.
Right. Let's go to the very beginning and say all about IFS, because we're using the terms, and it sounds confusing at first. It's been taking me a while to understand it. I've been reading about it all week.
So internal family systems, right? Okay. And the name is so sort of confusing because you think it's a family therapy, but it's not. Richard Schwartz was the developer, and he's still living, of IFS. He started off as actually a psychoanalyst, Freudian, right? And he then he is a marriage and family therapist. So he did family therapy. And then as he moved into individual work or working with the family members, he started applying family therapy concepts to his individual clients. And he came to the recognition that, how Freud says there's the ego, the id, and the superego, right? Mm-hmm. Different parts of a person. So he said, not only is there that, but there's multiple parts. Each person within them have multiple personalities in a way. And that sounds super confusing and scary for some people. But literally we are not one. We are made up of parts of us. And so, and that, when you say like, a part of me really wants to eat that cake because it looks so good. And a part of me is saying, no.
The devil and the angel on your shoulders.
Right? That inner conflict. A part of me really wants it. A part of me is saying, no way. Right? That's the inner conflict. And when you talk about like that makes sense to a lot of people. We do have these sort of inner conflicts, these polarized parts of us that are not aligned with each other, right? So when you think of it in that way, right? And also like, so when you think of having parts of yourself, it's kind of scary. It can be kind of scary. Am I not in control of myself if I have parts of myself and these little creatures living in me? Like, what does that mean? It does sound like, is it schizophrenia? Is it multiple personality disorder, which is now called dissociative identity disorder? And so I can understand where a person's coming from, but if you can just put that aside for a moment and think about what could be good about sort of this idea that we are made up of parts, right? And so what would it be like for me to say something, to share something that I'm so ashamed of about myself? If I say something like, a part of me feels this way versus I feel this way, right? It's really a way to decrease the shame associated with that. Noticing that I am not that. A part of me feels that way. That's not who I am at my core.
It's interesting because I understand this concept of protecting when there's some part of you that you can't accept, so you have to have it not part of you. But it is a part of you.
Right. So that would be an exile, I believe, right? So there's we can map it out for our listeners, right? The person, imagine, is this circle. Okay. Within the circle, we have what we call, there's four sort of, it's divided into four little areas. Okay. One is managers, one is firefighters, one is exiles, and in the core, in the center of the circle, is the self with a capital S. Some people refer to self as a soul. Some people refer to self as your spiritual being, or you can just think of it as the conductor of your orchestra, right? Or the leader of your family, in inner family, right?
Or it could just be your core, your core being, the way you want to be if you weren't having all these traumas.
It's your core being. And according to the theory of IFS, right? It's not a part, it's who you are at your core. And there's 6 C's: compassionate, curious, calm, creative, and 3 more that I can't think of. 2 more.
I think there's actually 8 of them, but whatever. There's a whole bunch of C's.
Yeah. Is it 6 or 8? I don't know.
Don't worry about it. There's a lot of them. Even Richard Schwartz was forgetting them in his video.
They all start with C.
They all start with C.
Yeah. And so that's who we are at our core, right? If you think of like if you think of a soul, right, of a person, if that's what you...
it's our essence.
It's our essence, our soul, our core.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. What happens is we are born with our self and different parts of us. And we all experience wounding at different stages, different ages, different points. We all experience wounding. Our parts are, little personalities, parts of our personality. You want to say it like that, right? And what happens is we experience, let's say, a wound. This wound, let's say it was shame, for example, right? As a child, perhaps, right? And so that part of us, the shame, this childlike part, that becomes exiled. I never want to feel that again. So my parts are going to do whatever they can to protect me from that shame that I felt, right? That trauma, that wound. So there's the managers and then there's the firefighters. Those are the protector parts. They protect me from those exiles.
And how do they do that?
So managers are proactive.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to try and control themselves, everyone around them. They're the ones who get us to do our work. They're the ones who get us, out of bed, get us, there are daily life managers. They get us to do stuff and they're proactive. They're going to do whatever it takes for me not to go to that wound, not to feel that shame. Their motto is not on my watch type of thing, right? You're not going to...
They keep you busy, but it's not distracting though.
Yeah, it is. Distraction can workaholics, right? Or it doesn't have to be perfectionism. Anything sort of to prevent me from feeling that shame.
So they are distracting, but in a theoretically productive way.
Yeah.
Okay.
We need them. We need all our parts. And
can't get any work done otherwise.
And Richard Schwartz will say there are no bad parts because all of our parts have good intentions. They're all trying to protect us in some shape or form. So even the parts of me that I can't stand, I wish I didn't have, right? But they're there for a reason. They're doing what they're doing for a reason. And it's a good reason. It's a good intention. It's trying to protect me. And so what IFS does is it allows us to get to know all of these parts and understand how they are protecting us in order to allow them to shift. And how does that happen? By healing the wound that they're protecting. If I can heal the wounds that my manager is protecting, a part of me is protecting, then it no longer has to protect me in that way. And then it can shift to its natural desire, its natural,
Right. So is it a matter of degree? Like, you can work and then you could be a workaholic. You can be an extreme workaholic.
Mhm.
So if you're trying to work because you can't face something, is that what you mean by shifting? It's not that you'll stop working. It's you won't work to the extent of having no life.
Right. We're talking about the extreme parts of ourselves. That's what people come to therapy for. If I'm just working and doing my job, I don't need therapy, right? But if I find that, I'm constantly working to the point where my spouse is so irritated and my kids are being neglected and whatever, then you want to look at what's going on here. What is happening, right? Yeah.
So those are the managers.
Those are the managers. The other parts are called firefighters. They're the reactive parts. So let's say something happens, a trigger, and I feel that same shame, that exiled shame, the firefighters are going to come right in, right? And so firefighters are the parts of a client that can be really tricky for therapists. Some therapists are highly intimidated by their firefighters. Some therapists love working with the firefighters. The firefighters can be impulsive. They can appear detrimental or harmful, right? But until you get to know and understand why they're doing what they're doing, they're going to look like that, right? So if we talk about extreme things, the self-harm, suicidal ideation, eating disorders. It could also just be binge eating. It could just be, any way that a person self-soothes that is problematic, right? And I put that in air quotes.
Right. How could that not be? I mean, you said they're all parts are good. How can those parts ever be good? I mean, like you could say workaholism is just a matter of shifting to an appropriate amount of work.
Right. So how can suicidal ideation be good, right? What does that even mean? What does that even mean, right? So the response is, I'm in so much pain right now, and the only way I can relieve myself of that pain is to end my life. That's a protector. I'm protecting myself from that pain, right? Of course, we don't want anybody to do that, but even the thought of it, I can control my pain. I can get rid of my pain by ending my own life. Does that make sense?
I'm still trying to struggle on how it could possibly be good. The best way I can conceptualize it is you think a fever is bad, but really a fever is a sign of a response to infection. So would you say this would be good in quotation marks, and it's showing that there's a problem? If you didn't have a response, you wouldn't know there's a problem?
Not really. No. So let's say somebody is self-harming, cutting, right? Mm-hmm. How is that good? How is that a protector? What does that even mean, right? And so what the firefighters are doing is trying to stuff back down the pain, the emotional pain, right? The pain has surfaced, emotional pain has surfaced. I'm trying whatever I'm going to take to get rid of it, right? Mm-hmm. And so somebody, let's say self-harming, maybe cutting, right? Mm-hmm. How does that protect the system? Because if I cut myself, that's physical pain. Emotional pain, I have no control over. Physical pain, though, first of all, it's a distraction from the emotional pain, but as well, I get to choose how much it's going to hurt me. I control that, mm-hmm. right? And so by cutting, perhaps that is my way of getting rid of the emotional pain, right? And we also know, right, that from a medical perspective, you get a cut or wounds, your hormones, the different endorphins or whatever it is,
right,
to soothe you. So in that way, I'm protecting myself from the emotional pain.
Protecting in a dysfunctional way. I mean, to be fair, when you're a workaholic to the extreme, you're doing something similar. You're both, in a way, you're a distraction rather than facing the problem. But how do we call these parts good? That's what I'm still stuck on.
Because their intentions are good.
They mean well, but they don't do well.
Exactly. And they're stuck in these extreme roles and they don't know any way out. If I stop cutting myself, I'm going to have to feel the pain. So I'm stuck. I have to cut myself so that I don't feel the emotional pain.
So how do you fix this?
Right. And so then in IFS therapy, an IFS therapist will ask, let's say, the cutting part of oneself. And again, the IFS therapist doesn't have an agenda. We're not trying, of course, the end goal, yes, we want the person to find productive ways to deal with emotional overwhelm, but we're not coming to fix or change any part of oneself, because then that part feels threatened, right? It's a very respectful and gentle therapy. So let's say talking to the cutting part of oneself, right? Well, there's different sort of steps, also sort of like a formula that you go through, but essentially you're asking, what are you afraid will happen if you stop cutting, right? And by that question, then you're getting to the exile. If I stop cutting, right, and it's a process till you get there, but the part speaks for itself, and that sounds super weird, but it's true. The part will say something like, if I stop cutting, I'm going to feel that shame. So I cut so that I don't have to ever feel that shame ever again, right? And so then I, as the therapist, can offer what we call a hope merchant. I can say to the cutting part of oneself, if you knew that we can go to the shame and heal that shame, would you still need to cut yourself? And would you want to still cut yourself if you knew that we can heal that exile, that wounded part of yourself? And 99.9% of the time, the firefighter or the manager, whoever it is, will say, yeah, I don't believe it can happen, but if I could heal that shame, then I won't need to do that. And what would you rather do if you weren't cutting? I would like to draw. I would like to, I don't know, do something fun or creative or helpful to me, to my system, right? And that's what we call the original state of that part, right? So we came into this world with all these parts with, wonderful qualities and intentions. They get stuck in extreme roles when wounding happens. If we can heal the underlying pain, then they no longer have to do those things. So when we talk about symptoms, right? Symptoms are parts.
Right.
Anxiety is a part. Depression is a part. I am not depression. A part of me is feeling depressed, right?
Right. I think the important point that you're making here that makes IFS so different from so many therapies is it's not pathologizing.
Yes, depathologizing. That's right. That's right.
And it also gives control to the person as opposed to saying, you have this and I'm going to fix this.
Right. Exactly.
Let's figure out how you can help you by understanding
you. Yourself is your number one resource. And we can help the client tap into themselves. Self heals. I heard a podcast where Richard Schwartz says he wants to make a T-shirt, self heals, because it literally does.
Pun, right? It's a pun.
It literally does, though. And so the idea that you're building the person up, right? They're getting to know the different parts of themselves, getting to understand the wounding and why their parts do what they do, and the self creates this inner harmony. It creates this peace of mind, this this internal family as a system, right? And it's beautiful work. EMDR and IFS get to the same end result. The end result is either in EMDR, we call it reprocessing, and in IFS, we call it unburdening. It's the same thing. There's trauma there, and we're either reprocessing it or unburdening it, we're healing it. It gets the same result. EMDR goes straight to the target, straight to the trauma, and reprocesses it. IFS first seeks permission from those protectors to be allowed to go to the trauma to reprocess it. So when you say, which one do I use with which clients? It really depends on the person's system. If I see that the person's system takes to EMDR, I'll use EMDR. That's my preferred because it's so fast, so efficient, so effective, and it's lasting. If the person's system is protected and it needed to be protected, we need to respect that. Then I'll switch to IFS and have make sure that all their parts are validated and seen and acknowledged for their good intentions, and ask their permission to then go to the trauma.
And when you say ask the permission, do you then go back to EMDR? I mean, how do you heal the trauma once you have permission?
So IFS has a whole sort of way to unburden, a system to do that. And so we can use that. Or because I have the training in EMDR,
right.
My preference is to use EMDR if I can, if the person's system can tolerate it. Not always. And sometimes we'll have to do unburdening with IFS for a bunch of stuff and then eventually be able to do the EMDR, right? IFS is gently, like you think of it as an onion, right? EMDR goes straight to the core of the onion. IFS gently peels away layers to be able to get to the middle.
Are there certain type of people that do better with either therapy?
So I mean,
let's look for the signs of, you start with EMDR, and if you see resistance, you back off and go into IFS.
That's a good question. Because I had the training in both, so I will see if EMDR is a good fit. I may not even go beyond resourcing with my client. Resourcing is guided visualizations. If my client can't close their eyes because of their trauma, specifically women who experience sexual trauma, it's terrifying to close one's eyes. If they can't do that, and if they can't just gaze gently at the floor in order to go into their body because their bodies aren't safe, we're not doing EMDR.
Right. They're not ready. Right.
No. Right. So it really depends on the person, how they're presenting, what their their goals are for therapy. IFS is incredibly helpful. It doesn't even have to be trauma. It's just I'm coming in with an inner conflict, which so many clients, so many people have all the time, right? And it's helping me make that decision for myself. Really understanding what's going on for me and making the best decision based on like a self-led decision, as opposed to which emotion is stronger.
Right. I'm just wondering whether there's a certain personality type that would prefer. I mean, I think of, from what I'm understanding of IFS, is something that gives the person themselves more control. You're asking them permission, right? Their parts permission. You're putting them more in the driver's seat than in EMDR when you are the driver.
Right. And when I do EMDR, I let my clients know that they are the driver. Meaning, I say, if at any point this is too much for you, this is overwhelming, you say stop, we stop.
Right.
You don't go anywhere you're not ready to go to.
Right, but you're still the therapist. You're still driving that process as opposed to IFS, which seems to be more client-driven.
Yes, this is true. And what EMDR does, like I say, it's going straight to the trauma. It's getting the client's self from the IFS on board right away. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's the client is doing all the work. I literally am just having them tap and then process. I'm not doing anything. I don't even have to know what's going on in their mind. Their self is healing them doing this work. I'm just facilitating it, right? IFS is, helping the client to access that self because of the protectors. You think of it like the self is the sun, and then all these parts are clouds, and the sun is hidden from the view, right? And so often people who have experienced loss of trauma, there is no self yet. It's covered. It's completely covered.
I see.
So my work as a therapist is to help them go through those parts, remove those clouds, get those clouds to step back so that
those layers, right? Working through those layers so you can get to that core part.
That's right.
Oh, so I see that makes a lot of sense. How long does IFS take? Is there like a basic range?
No. So again, EMDR, right? Like in 6 sessions, I can, a person can reprocess an entire, train of thought. IFS, the thing is that we're always living and always developing and evolving. And so a person can, if they wanted to, be in IFS therapy forever. Or if they come with one specific issue and they resolve that issue, then they no longer have to be in therapy, right? But often we resolve one thing and then something else comes up and we want to look at that and really understand that part of us. And our parts are developing and expanding and changing and shifting. And we experience wounding in our daily life, even as adults, right? It's not only as children. And so, yeah.
Right.
So, depends really what the person's goals are and how long they're going to be in therapy.
Right. Something else I heard that I liked about IFS is that you would become less dependent on a therapist for this particular therapy and more ability to do things on your own once you learn it. Is that true?
Self-led. Once you become aware of yourself and can tap into that, Richard Schwartz says it's a paradigm shift. He said there would be no wars in the world if everybody was just self-led. Right. They let their self do the leading, right? There's no agenda. There's nothing to fix because the self creates harmony within, right? And our internal world definitely impacts our external world, and our external world will impact our internal world. So if we all were self-led, it would be just this beautiful, peaceful world.
Right. And also, again, because it's not pathologizing, anybody can do it. You don't have to have a disorder to use this particular program.
Right. And it's not disorder, right? It's not that. It's actually protectors, right? Like it's a person is having normal human responses to not normal situations. There's no disorder, right? It's really like it does away with the DSM,
right?
Which I love.
I know. No, I love that it's non-pathologizing and empowering, and I can imagine for some people, it can really, really be a major, major game changer for them, which is really amazing. And I'm so glad that you are talking about this with me and bringing this to so many people, as I think it can really, really be helpful. And also the EMDR. So first of all, we're not here to give medical advice. Please consult with your mental health professional. And the other thing I want to say is, I said this in the other talk with Robin Gutman, that I had said, well, if you're doing a therapy and your therapist or your therapeutic approach isn't working, then you should seek someone else. And she made the point of, well, yes and no, because it might be a sign that this person or this approach or both isn't right for you, or it might be a sign that you're getting somewhere. Right. So it's tricky.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I hear what you're saying. And to add to that is that not everyone is trained in EMDR and not everyone is trained in IFS.
Right.
There is the option for some people, if they're interested in keeping their therapist and working with an EMDR therapist and having the two therapists on the same page, right? So do the EMDR with the EMDR therapist and then go back to your other therapist and process what the reprocessing was like for you or whatever's coming up for you. That could be a possibility. And I think insurances, I don't accept insurance, but I think insurances may allow for that just on different days. Like it can't be on the same day.
Did you want to say something before I tell people how they can find you?
There was something in terms of, I think you had asked in terms of the trainings, right? EMDR, you really want to look for a therapist who's EMDR International Association approved, like meaning that the training was done through the International Association for EMDR. It's called EMDRIA, because that is like the gold standard. They have all these sort of offshoots. Teach yourself, EMDR somehow. It's sort of not. It's not controlled.
EMDR training late. No, don't do that.
Right. Yeah. Want to do through the International Association, IFS. It's incredibly hard to get into the training because there are so few trainers. It's also from the IFS Institute, and so. Anybody trained in IFS will have gone through the institute, whereas EMDR not necessarily. So that's all.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes, definitely go to someone who is properly trained in that particular therapy. I think that's a good point. Okay, so I really want to thank you so much for doing this with me, and tell people that we can find you at rosenbaumtherapy.com, Rosenbaum therapy.com. And they can follow you on Instagram at rosenbaumtherapy.com. And you do therapy for both New York and New Jersey residents, both online and in telehealth, and I presume in person.
Mm-mm.
You're not
Just
doing in-person
telehealth.
therapy.
Mhm.
Wow.
Mhm.
Wow. So telehealth for mental health has really been also a major game changer. So I'm very grateful for that, because we definitely need more practitioners very, very badly. So thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
It really was. I really appreciate it. Be well.
You too.
Thanks for listening to the JOMA Preventative Health Podcast. If you've enjoyed this, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and share this with your friends. For more information, check out our Instagram at JOMA_org. Check out our website, www.joma.org, that's JOWMA.org, or email us at health@joma.org.